Hey Charlie, I just found out yesterday that Joe Schmitt's still kicking at 96, more or less in Texas.
For those of you who don't know Joe Schmitt, if you've ever seen Norman Rockwell's painting of Gus Grissom and John Young suiting up for Gemini 3, Joe Schmitt is the guy on the left suiting up Gus. Joe was there from every Mercury guy onward through Apollo, and I think even into Skylab and Shuttle. And we were just having breakfast, and Al Rochford, who's another suit tech, came by, and we started somehow getting on to talking about Norman Rockwell. And to make a long story short, Rockwell was very exacting, very detail-oriented, and he realized, Rochford told him, you know, Joe was suiting up Gus, but I was suiting up John Young. And so Rockwell requested a photograph of Al. In the finished painting, though, it's Joe is 21 years older than Al, but it's Al's young face on Joe's body in the painting. One other thing.
Andy, I have to tell you that Joe Schmitt is probably more famous for being on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood than anything else.
That's right. How many of you know? We'll get into that in 1 second. I just want to say, as far as John Llewellyn, my favorite John Llewellyn story was that as you guys were getting ready to come down, there was a typhoon approaching the recovery area. They ended up having to move the recovery area, but Chris Kraft was so absolutely furious at Wally Schirra that John offered to him to bring you guys down in the typhoon.
I agree with John Llewellyn.
Why don't you all line up at the mic if you have questions, and while you're doing that, Al.
Let me mention one other thing. You just reminded me of it, because you need a lesson anyway. You mentioned the back room there from Flight Ops. They had a sign hanging in that room, and that sign said, "In God we trust, all others bring data." And I mentioned that because I have an opportunity. You opened the door last night, Andy, to give you a chance to get things straight on human-caused global warming. Because whenever I do talk about that subject from time to time, and I rely on that particular sign, and I always ask people to ask themselves. One, I ask people to look at the data themselves. Having recently been involved in a controversy about this with a letter out to, what you recall, out to the administrator, that try to keep out of the politics, and I always ask for people to look at the data themselves. And the criticism that came back from that article had to do with, what do these guys know? What are these dumb fighter jocks and engineers, what do they know about climate science? Well, I have to tell you something. Those people that we were talking about, the people in Flight Ops and all of that, I would trust them to look at data and come up with the best answer, not a political answer, the best answer more than I ever would with any scientist, I'm a physicist, incidentally, that I've ever worked with, because they knew that they were betting other people's lives on that data when they looked at it. So I always tell people, you out there in the audience, go look at the data yourself. Don't just listen to what other people are saying, especially the media. That's because you've got to look at the data yourself, and it's not that complicated. And then ask yourself 4 questions. Is there anything unusual about this temperature or this temperature trend? Does carbon dioxide force the temperature or vice versa? Is the current temperature and carbon dioxide level ideal? And can man control the Earth's temperature over the sun, the oceans, and the orbital changes throughout history. So I can give you an unequivocal answer. The answer to all those four is no. And so I, just a second.
I just don't want to take too much time for this topic.
I know that. And I'm doing this in hopes that we can get Andy here to ask himself those questions.
I'll be happy to ask myself all kinds of questions. I'm just glad that we're continuing to get data. I think the most important thing is to continue to get the data. Speaking
Hey, you guys, this is about Apollo. This is about Apollo.
Yeah, right, that's what I said. Speaking of data, because you make a very important point, and Charlie the other night, we were talking about the moment when they were coming into the moon on Apollo 16, and beautiful moon in the light of Earth, that bluish gray of Earthshine. And Charlie said, well, frankly, I was just hoping we were on target. And each of you has had moments where you trusted the guys on the ground to make the right calculations, right?
Yeah, no question about it.
The whole mission.
Yeah, the whole mission. You had no way to launch commit. The guys had to make the right decisions that their systems were ready to go. And then coming into the moon, you know, you'd come 230, 40,000 miles, and you were shooting for a point 170 miles above the moon. You divide 170 by 240,000, it's not very big margin. So, but you just trusted those guys that they had you in the right spot, and you make the burn when they told you to burn, and it was going to work out.
Dick Gordon, you had to make a burn all by yourself in the command module while Pete and Al were on the surface. And you had to do it on the far side of the moon. And you had to trust that data, but you also had to trust that you had all of the procedures in case of a malfunction in your head and the simulator runs and all that. Can you talk about that moment when you had to make that engine firing by yourself over the far side of the moon?
Well, Andy, I think he said it right. The procedures were already there. It was all done and trained for and done over and over and over again. And it became, you know, the flight is easier than the training. Let's put it that way. And it was, hey, to get rid of P now, I was okay and comfortable. I was able to do it all by myself. That wasn't, you know, when you think about those kinds of things, but that was one of the insignificant parts of the training. I reflect back, and really what I really think about is the training to come back home alone that I went through, and every command module pilot has gone through. The thought of trying to be able to manage the total aspects of that kind of thing, and that's part of the training cycle. So the burn by yourself, Al did.
Let me ask you a question. Did you have the center couching when you did that?
Yeah, didn't you remember? I couldn't occupy 3 couches, one was enough.
What's the center couching?
Not at the time.
Okay, what happened to you when you made the burn?
I was in my left-hand couch.
You were in the left-hand couch. If you were in the same position I was in when you made that burn, as soon as the engine kicked in, you were looking out the side window because the couch swung all the way up into that empty space.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
They can't remember anymore. He made a good point here when he talks about the training was a whole lot more difficult than the mission. Of course, the price for failure was a lot different in the simulator. But let me give you this, an 11-day mission where the only thing, and this was after the fire, everything had been fixed, the only thing that would even qualify as other than just a slight anomaly was an electric power brief interruption and failure. In 11 days, can you imagine a simulator run where you ever had anything that smooth?
Well, speaking of simulator runs versus flight and the difference between the two, Fredo. your flight was about as different from the nominal as you can imagine. And in fact, as you've said many times, they never simulated what happened to you on 13 because they thought it wasn't even worth it. They thought there was no way you'd get home if all those things happened.
Well, not quite in that context. They had evaluated, obviously, through failure mean effects analysis, all the credible failures that could happen. Explosions was one of those variety, and the aspects of an explosion where you're going to lose the vehicle and the crew. Of course, they were thinking mostly rocket engines. But this was a case, though, where one thing, and I didn't get to really listen to the inter-room tapes, interloops, I should say, till well after the flight. And it spoke well of what it pays really to know your systems and not necessarily canned procedures, because when this happened, the people I was most proud of listened to those tapes were the command module people immediately after this happened, when they finally got to realize it was a real problem. And there were no procedures to do what they were doing, in essence troubleshooting in various ways to try to stop the leak in the second tank. And it was kind of on the fly with, Charlie mentioned they had a support room, they had support rooms for each discipline on the other side of the hallway from Mission Control that they were counseling with, and it was open mic dialogue, and then I'm sure they were on the phone with somebody else, somewhere else, but they were totally ad-libbing what they were trying to do to save the spacecraft in essence. And it got to a point where I could, knowing the people, some of them, I could know their voices, I could hear the sort of defeated inflection in their voices when they knew they had lost the game. And then Glenn Luddy, who at that time, his crew had come on not too long after the explosion. He always likes to kid Krantz when they're together and say, Krantz left me with this bag of worms. But at any rate, Glenn called them back to attention and told them they got to get this thing powered down and quick, because they were eating into our entry batteries, which we were going to need to get through entry. In fact, they ate into about a third of the power in those batteries. But they just, all at once, they just came back to attention and went back to work, and now sort of integrated again on the voice loops how to turn this thing on, because this thing was never supposed to be turned off. So they had to ad-lib a power down procedure in real time. So I thought it was amazing. They knew their business so well in their systems. And see, that would normally be done in a much more formal way. You'd have a book manager that would develop this procedure, and we'd take it in a simulator and play with it and redline it several times. And finally, it even went through a formal board to get approved and signed off. So that to generate that and to call it the normal way to get the printed book for a power down procedure would have probably taken 6 weeks at least. And they did it on the fly. Now it was easier for the LIM guys. In fact, Jim had asked me to go to the LIM early, so I was already down to the LIM when they said go to the LIM. And Jim arrived, but we had a book. We had an activation book which we could ad-lib off of. And frankly, there were very few, I guess there were very few or no LIM people in the control center, because they weren't supposed to be to go to work till the next day when we go power up to LIM. So they got called in on the fly from home to come in and join the fray. But I'm just saying that was it was really accreditation to the importance of knowing in great detail your business, your vehicle, your systems, which it became very apparent that that came to play.
I'd like to add something, a story that I don't think I've ever told you, Fred, that we heard about Apollo 13. We were home. We lived right across the street from the Manned Spacecraft Center, and on TV it comes on, and they had this. I got in my car, drove across, went to Mission Control, listened to the air down what was going on, And Jack Swigert, who'd been added late on the mission, very, very late. Jack and I had worked together on developing malfunction procedures for the command module back before Apollo 7. But I listened for 10 minutes to what these guys were doing. I went back home, went to sleep, because I knew that your mission control was just getting started to really doing these things that had to be absolutely immaculate. I could tell in 10 minutes that the flight crew had done everything that they possibly could and were so far ahead of the ground on taking those steps because they were doing it for survival at that point. The ground was going to develop recovery and how to get everybody home. You guys, I went home, went to sleep after 10 minutes.
And do you remember having trouble with those and the pressure differential?
Yeah, we were trying out these tin cans full of whatever it was.
Peaches.
We had various fruit, and so I got one of these cans, and it was like a can of tuna fish. And I popped the can open, and it must have been, I don't know how many PSI pressure inside that can. But when I released it, that pressure was released, that peaches and I mean, just exploded all over.
Well, my favorite comment was in the debriefing. You know, they get the guys back and they're all sitting in the debriefing and they get to the subject about these experimental cans, how the cans work out. And John Young was a man of few words. He said, they were fine once the juice left. I hope you guys have some questions because we have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and this is a rare opportunity. So please come up to the mics now.